So welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning into this interview today with me, myself, Florian, who is covering the DACH region for Rize ETF. Rize ETF, of course, Europe's first thematic specialist, focusing on thematic ETFs. And with me today in this new sort of format, which we started calling Friends of Rize, is Rex Raimond. Rex works together with the Global Alliance for Future of Food and also the Transformational Investing food systems. So it's an excellent guest for us because obviously a lot of our investors and clients know that one of our major themes is the sustainable future of food. And it's a theme we as Rize are really passionate about and speak a lot about to our clients. So it's amazing to have a guest here on today who can really give some more insights on this topic, who's doing this on his day-to-day work and really has some great insights on the space. So Rex, could you briefly introduce yourself? Thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure. And it's been great to get to know Rize ETF. So Rex Raimond with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and in particular running a project in partnership with the Global Alliance that's called Transformational Investing in Food Systems. Global Alliance is a group of charitable foundations, mostly based in Europe and North America, some in other parts of the world, but with a collective interest in how do we transform our food systems with an eye towards better outcomes. So better outcomes for communities, for people, human health, and for the earth. A lot of the work is focused on some coordination around grant making, joint learning, really articulating what those pathways of transformation are. And I think one of the things that's interesting to your listeners is the application of true cost accounting evaluation frameworks to really create insight into the positive and negative externalities of our current food system, and then how do you articulate and identify the pathways to get to food systems that minimize the negative externalities and maximize the positive ones. And my work with transformational investing in food systems focuses on the mission investment teams and other aligned impact investors and other, say, institutional investors that have longer time horizons to bring them along in this journey towards food system transformation. And the work on true cost accounting and how that's applied to understand and mitigate risk in these systems and make that actionable for investors, that's really core to my work.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Rex, thanks so much for the quick intro. Some amazing work you're doing there. And obviously, you and your work are aware of the challenges our food systems bear. What we do at Rize, we end up speaking a lot about, the future of food, what sustainability issues are really related to that theme. Without being too direct, I don't think everyone shares that same awareness of what, how important or what big of an issue our food systems are with regards to whether it's be biodiversity, climate change, etc. So why don't we start out with, why do you think, although the emissions coming from our food systems are so well documented with regards to research and information out there, there is a lack of awareness really why it's such a big important part? Obviously, if we look at it, a third roughly of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide come from our food systems. Obviously the part livestock and animal products pay is enormous as well. So it's something that's in our daily life. But I already mentioned it briefly, but I think you can give a better overview of what really are the biggest contributors to those emissions. Which subsectors really do play a big part, and which ones might be slightly underrated or we aren't really aware of that they have such a detrimental impact on the sustainability aspect of our food systems?
Well, I think you've said it, Florian. We are seeing an increase in awareness, but still it feels like we're at the beginning. COP27, the recent climate conference, was a good indication of that growing awareness of the role of our food systems as a contributor to climate change. We'll talk about this more later on in the conversation, but the COP15 on biodiversity that just started, I think for the first time ever has a food day. in recognition of the fact that the way we produce food is the largest contributor to biodiversity loss globally. So I think the awareness is growing, but the action, turning that awareness into action, is still really at the very early stages. So as you mentioned in terms of climate change contributions from the food sector, I think most people are by now familiar with the fact that the beef and dairy production are some of the biggest contributors to climate change, and part of that is conversion of land to pristine land and forests to commodity production for cattle feed or cattle raising directly. But some other really important parts that especially us in the Western world aren't maybe that familiar with, the way we produce rice around the world. One of the largest commodity producer around the world is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. The post harvest losses and food waste. So in emerging economies, the problem is more with the lack of infrastructure, and from the moment crops are harvested, a lot of it goes to waste even before it gets to the consumer. In the more industrialized world, higher income economies, a major contributor is food waste, so post-consumer food waste. So there are lots of the opportunities for business are also there. We see in the US, for instance, there's a whole network and a whole investor network and business network that's purely focused on innovative solutions for reducing post-consumer food waste, and partly as a solution to the emissions that result from that waste. So those are just a couple of sort of the big components of how food systems contribute to climate change and biodiversity loss. And the opportunities, of course, are then inherent in these. So we can dig into some of the causes of how do we get here, and how do we get out of this situation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you pointed out perfectly. It's so important, I think, to understand is if we talk about the future of food, it's not just what we eat and how we eat. It's the entire value chain of food systems that need to be looked at. It's not just good enough to change your diet, although, as we said, is a massive aspect of it. It doesn't solve all the other issues that are associated really with this topic. So I think it's so worth to understand that there's an entire value chain associated with food systems, and their issues at every single step. So I think you outlined that quite perfectly there. And then you mentioned the funding. We obviously talk a lot about, with COP27, we talk about climate financing, where do subsidies go to, government funding, etc. And I actually read the Global Alliance report for the future of food. That's how I obviously found you guys as well. Which is called Untapped Opportunities, Climate Financing for Food Systems. Everyone here, I strongly urge you to read that because it's super insightful. But one of the most staggering numbers in there, I thought, was that only 3% of public finance actually goes to our food systems. So earlier we talked about, global financing, and we talked about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems. Yet only 3% of global financing really goes to food systems, to make changes. So there you clearly see the disconnection between the two. Maybe you could evaluate a bit more or elaborate a bit more, that sort of number and where climate financing might be going. Like, why is it so low, essentially? Why is only so little going to the food system?
Yeah, it's been a great hook, to be honest, that 30% of emissions and 3% of climate finance. So there's definitely an imbalance there. It really goes to the just emerging awareness of the issue, and then how do you take action with that awareness, right? So most people are aware of the Paris Accord and the structure that created with these nationally determined contributions. So it's up to the countries to decide how they're going to going to mitigate climate change, but also what measures they need to put in place to adapt to climate change. And there we see that there are still kind of food systems and some agricultural production and agricultural production methods. In some countries, you see some attention being paid to some of the infrastructure and food waste issues. But most countries haven't really clearly identified a solid strategy and plan for transitioning their own food production systems and food systems towards a more sustainable system. So as a result, they haven't really identified investment priorities. They haven't identified kind of what type of finance is needed where, and that's hamstringing the efforts to direct more capital in efficient ways to the right places. So that's definitely part of it. Another part is really that we have these entrenched systems, and we've partly created those kind of with public finance. We go back, I think kind of most people will be aware that some of the breakthroughs in the green revolution, crop breeding, technology breakthroughs really enabled us globally to boost productivity in our agricultural sector tremendously. And it has had enormous benefits in terms of how much food we're able to produce. But it also has led to a number of unintended negative consequences where now we have these kind of highly efficient, highly focused production systems that focus on essentially 5 crops, 5 commodities around the world that are highly concentrated. All our plant breeding is going to increasing productivity, a narrow set of metrics. And we've lost sight of so many other things, other types of value that come with a healthy food system. Crop biodiversity, diversity of diets, healthy soils, which there's more and more research that underpins that understanding of if we grow crops in healthy soil biomes, that translates into kind of more nutritious products and actually translates into a healthy gut biome. So that link between healthy soils and healthy people is actually quite direct. And we're really just starting to uncover some of those relationships. And those things have been sort of on the sideline of our entire the focus of our food system and what we're funding with public dollars, public funds, and as a result also with our private investments. So I think that also results in a system, it's quite entrenched, that is going to take time to transition to a system that is more, you might call it more regenerative, more holistic, in nature, and that rewards farmers, producers, companies for multiple forms of value that a well-functioning ecosystem or food system provides to society, because there are a lot of co-benefits that come with healthy food systems, like the kind of biodiversity values, kind of healthy or clean water, water infiltration, and then kind of let alone the health effects of a well-functioning food system. So a lot of avoided cost to society by changing our food system. But we have a lot of work to do to change those systems, to change those policy structures, to change subsidies, and that's really part of what's needed to then identify those priorities and create the mechanisms to also receive an increase in funding, because I don't think many countries really have those mechanisms in place.
Yeah, because I mean, you mentioned it earlier at the start, the externalities of the food systems are obviously enormous. So there's a lot of stuff that can be tackled if we don't just focus on greenhouse gas emissions, but healthy diets, biodiversity, clean water are all separate issues that all are impacted negatively from our current food systems too. So the issues you could be solving with addressing food systems are quite vast, on that side. And I mean, I totally agree where you say that the funding and the right policy making should be the catalyst for this, because if we we look at, you know, the universe that exists in the on you know the listed side, you know, of the investment world. The solutions exist today, you know, to tackle some of these challenges. You obviously see even more on the private side that these solutions exist today. It's just channeling the funding, you know, having right policy frameworks to address it, because we see it here, you know, in Europe, the EU taxonomy did not address in a great extent, or barely really, you know, food systems. It doesn't come up as part of the 6 environmental challenges. It should be really its own, you know, but that's exactly where the mismatch is. But it's great insight there. And I mean, just the next point, you already essentially answered it, but the 3% of public finance I mentioned earlier, if we then look at the 3% that go to food systems, I think I read only 1% of those 3%. Yeah. So it's 528 billion of public money that's spent actually goes to practices that have a harmful impact, you know, on the environment or climate. So even the little funding in relation that goes to food systems is still not even designed to have a positive environmental impact on our food systems. So that just shows, never mind how little is channeled that way, the little that's channeled that way is still, you know, not going to the right places. So maybe you can talk a bit about that, because I think it was environmental conditioning. That was the word, where the 1%, you know, that's 1% funding with environmental conditions. Maybe you can talk a bit about how that sort of looks, because I find that astonishing, that even the little funding that goes there is still going to whatever it might be, you know, subsidy for the biggest meat producers or stuff like that.
Right. It's it shows the potential, right? But it also shows, it goes to that entrenchment of our current industry and our current policies. And I think for your audience that is listening with an ear towards publicly listed companies, we have to recognize that a lot of the food companies, food and agricultural companies, are also thriving because of public subsidies. Those shape markets, they buy down risk, and they keep the system functioning as it is, and to a large extent. So be aware of the risk of business as usual. I think that
Absolutely.
as the conversation really starts to pick up about redirecting subsidies and using public money to reward public good, that is going to shift business models to businesses that are part of an agroecological or an agricultural system that is kind of more aware and more intentional about the interdependencies of, like you said, climate, biodiversity, clean water, healthy people, and business models that serve then and that generate value in all. As you said, our current state of agricultural finance, public finance for agriculture and food systems, is still fairly narrowly focused. There's always a production component, or typically there is a production component, and then there's a component that may be related to mitigating some of the external harms. So condition, you know, but as you said, from our research, it shows that kind of public finance that has environmental or social conditions attached to them, so focused on kind of specific environmental positive outcomes, is just kind of 1% of the pie. All the other kind of subsidies, which are still insufficient to fund the transition to more sustainable food systems globally, but the vast majority still has a production or component to it.
Yeah. Is there a way, maybe just from that point, what do you think could be the biggest catalyst to increase those environmental conditions, you know, for public funding to be released? Because obviously that's what we should be looking at, you know, that the funding at government or policy level is directed in a way that is sustainable or environmentally conscious. So what do you think could boost that, or could make ensure that so much more of the funding is actually going somewhere where, you know, to an area that doesn't have massive negative externalities? What do you think on that?
Right. Um, so some of the work that we're involved in, and I mentioned it in the introduction, is the work on true cost accounting. So and that informs policy. So it's starting to take hold in policy amongst policymakers. And it enables policymakers to review a broad range of positive and negative externalities that come from policy decisions. I think it's also applicable to the private sector. I think ESG integration is a good step, but it's not sufficient to really understand the interdependencies of business and business viability in the medium to long term on the range of the issues that we've been or conditions that we have been talking about. Kind of food. So in that context, food security and food and nutrition security is certainly a primary outcome of those kind of public investments in food systems. But we've seen that our current systems haven't really, even though in theory, we're producing enough food to feed the world population, it's not getting to the people that need it, and it's being offered in a form that is leading to other kind of negative health outcomes. That's the kind of the nutrition component of it. So even if we started to switch some of those, the focus from sort of a narrow set of metrics, even in the context of food security, and we start to broaden that to food and nutrition security, and understanding how we create nutritious foods, and that again comes back to some of the fundamental kind of practices on the farm related to healthy soils, to what crops we produce and where, and how those are kind of preserved and packaged and delivered to the consumer. That expansion of our of the metrics and our understanding, and then also the methodologies for evaluating the range of value to society for policymakers and to a kind of business kind of for our private investors or our private finance. That may be I think that's where we see kind of huge potential for moving the needle.
Yeah, I'm gonna come to that private finance side in a second. But even you mentioned it, if we were just going from a food security, feed the planet, nutritional side, even then the numbers don't add up, right? Like it's
Right.
not like it's not like the meat industry or the animal product side is responsible for 80 or 100% of the global calories. That doesn't
Right.
even add up either. So it's obviously an interesting point, right? Because it's not like you ensure secure food security by just keep funding these type of industries, because it's not like they are responsible for the majority of the global calorie intake. But that's a different side. And you mentioned it earlier. With the public markets, it's obviously a crucial topic, and that's why there was so much time involved in developing this classification, for our theme, because you must be so careful to not be, intrinsically exposed again to the issue, right? With animal products, or whether it be on the fertilizer side, if we talk about soil, it's so, like you mentioned, you don't want to be caught up in the dying or the industry that's really the problem. So it's really great attention you got to pay there, on the public side, what companies you include and what you look at. And going away from the public side, maybe on the private side, because that's obviously your main area of expertise, we always look there as well, because we find it very interesting. If we look at valuations, developments, they obviously support the public side, so we always have an eye on it, what's happening there. In the private sector, with regards to the future of food, where do you see what excites you the most? Where do we see the most activity? Where's the biggest potential? Maybe you can sum up 1, 2, 3 areas that you find really interesting. Obviously, I'm a big vertical farming fan. So I'm sure that's somewhere there, you know. But yeah, maybe you can just give us some insight on the private side.
I think technology and things like vertical, those high intensity growing operations, especially in urban and peri-urban areas, there's a role for that for sure. It's bringing healthy food close to communities, to their large urban centers, where the consumers are. I think it's an important thing. There's of course been a lot of attention to alternative proteins. I think that sector will continue to develop and mature, and work out some of the concerns that are now rising, also with some of the kind of highly processed nature of some of those ingredients. For instance, but also kind of where the ingredients are coming from. There have been some concerns about actually sourcing from some of the same regions that are also supplying to the cattle industry. So some of those things will get worked out. The regenerative ag movement is focusing a lot of attention, and I think doing a lot of education around the importance of healthy soils. I think there will be a move towards consumer awareness in that regard as well. You see some large companies that are making regenerative ag commitments, and those are really focused on soil health and really the practices on the ground that support healthy soils, and as a result reduce the need for chemical inputs as well. So kind of less chemicals in our environment and fewer chemicals on our dinner plate, I think are a good thing. And then some other things that excite me are some of the really integrated business models, and I see those emerging more at the regional levels, really around the world. There's some great examples in India, Zambia. They exist in North America and Europe as well. But they're companies that are creating some more integrated and diverse supply lines, so that they can source from the same farmers but multiple crops, and get them to the consumers in kind of minimally processed form, so that healthy foods are become kind of more affordable. And kind of more, and the relationship between the consumer and the producer gets somewhat better established or re-established, where that was a strong connection in the past. So it has some of the components with regards to sort of income inequality, social justice, some of those elements you see really being intentionally incorporated into those business models as well. So I'd be looking for those as well, especially for investors who are interested in some of the place-based or region-specific impacts that their investments in food systems can have.
Yeah, no, brilliant. That's some really exciting stuff, and I think some of them are already further developed than others. Some already exist with a range, obviously not as many, but with a range of companies in the public markets. But others, like the integrated supply lines, etc., might exist in a different form. But obviously, that's something that obviously plays a massive part, right? The cost side, whilst obviously we can talk about the sustainability side, etc., it must also be affordable, with regards to poverty alleviation, equality, etc. That's really something we must also always focus on too, right? And that obviously can also be a barrier to the whole development, right? So that's really exciting, that the last example you mentioned there. And earlier I had mentioned the sort of subsidies or funding, public funding, government funding that goes to our food systems. If I remember correctly, you had also discussed to an extent what sort of level of funding would be required for the different, value chain parts of a sustainable food system. Are you able to put a rough number, or, sort of where would we, if we really want to make some progress, and let's say, we would give some advice to policymakers where to direct some of the funding, how is that looking? What sort of the funding required, maybe annually or over the next decade, however you're looking at this, to make some proper progress with the transition to sustainable food systems?
That's yeah, I'm glad that there's now some research to put some numbers on those. And the indication, the estimates are in the range of 300 to 350 billion US dollars per year
Yeah,
to implement the actions really needed to transform our food systems. And that is, just to give some examples, about in the range of 30 billion towards healthy diets, about 40 billion to regenerative agriculture. A big part is nature protection and restoration. So especially that conversion of natural lands to agriculture. If we can put a halt to that, that would go a long way towards mitigating those negative externalities. And so there's a 65 billion a year price tag on that.
yeah,
Then some other, healthy oceans. We didn't talk about that very much, but our blue economy is a huge part of the food system, and a big part of the economy, global economy as well. So there's lots of opportunities there. We talked about protein supply, reduced food waste and loss, some local food systems, digitalization of food systems is in there as well. And I didn't mention that really as an opportunity, but there's so much interesting work in ag tech and the intersection of ag tech, climate tech, fintech.
yeah,
There could be some real opportunities that emerge. Also at these within the context of strengthening regional food systems. Kind of the move with direct to consumer, for instance, during the pandemic, has been a huge boost to both to farmers and to those kind of creative intermediaries that are getting healthy food to our urban consumers. So
yeah. So
that I think.
that's
No, go ahead.
yeah. Sorry, because I just wanted to pick up that number again. So you mentioned some, obviously, some research we take it with a pinch of salt, but if we say somewhere between 300 and 350 billion, US dollars per year to support sustainable, parts of the future food systems. We mentioned earlier it's $530 billion per year going
Right.
into subsidies, funding, of parts of the value chain that have harmful or, have negative externalities. Sounds to me like the money would be there somewhere to redirect it. So
Exactly.
that that's interesting, right? That's
Yeah.
a good side note on when talking numbers. Put them in context to what's already there. We don't need to really we don't need to make massive amounts of funds available. They do already exist. They would just have to be
Yeah.
redirected to an extent. And you obviously put some numbers on it, the different
Right.
subsectors or innovation aspects
Hmm.
that we could increase with that. So
Yeah.
that's
And Florian, if I may, just to give an example of where that's
please, yeah.
happened. So the city of Copenhagen in Denmark, of course, the Nordic countries, we often look
Yeah.
for some progressive examples, but it's a very practical one in this case. So um, they have public funding for their kind of food and meals, providing meals in public schools and other public institutions, so hospitals, retirement homes, etc. And they took their existing budget and worked with farmers in the region that are already supplying to those food purchasing programs, and with the kitchen staff and the restaurateurs of those public institutions. And they figured out a way, working together with those different stakeholders, to repurpose their existing budget, not increase it. It's not an additional subsidy. It's working with the existing budget to convert the entire supply chain from a mix of maybe a minority of sort of organic or kind of low pesticide, low chemical input, but the vast majority kind of from kind of traditional commercial farmers to go towards 100% organic, and use that really to create a market in the region that's supplying to the city of Copenhagen for a different form of agriculture that minimizes the use of pesticides, for instance. And in that case, one of the drivers in particular was water pollution. So it addressed another issue, but it also then created a market for kind of more sort of organic production. It kind of created a retraining and sort of pride in profession amongst the kitchen staff, because they went from the scissor to the knife. So the scissor to open bags and toss them in a pot, to the knife to actually be cooking again with basic ingredients. So it's just a really concrete example of how a shift in mindset and can use, and the use of public finance can really change a market. So
yeah. I mean, and that's a brilliant example. And I mean, that there are also, we don't have to be too negative. I'm sure we could talk for another hour about some positive examples where this has happened, right? So they definitely exist. We see some development in it, which is a huge positive. So, I guess we're both excited to see some more of those more often in the future. So that's a brilliant example you mentioned there. And maybe, Rex, just to close out on this one, because we've in the prelude we briefly talked about it. Obviously yesterday, so today's the 8th of December. Yesterday was the 7th of December, where COP15 started, where the entire focus is on biodiversity. So after COP27 earlier, we now have COP15 on biodiversity. And biodiversity, you mentioned it a couple of times already in the last half an hour, but the link between biodiversity, climate change, and our food systems is certainly a very important one. So I would like to, to conclude this one, would really for you to give us an overview again. How do these work together? Why is biodiversity such an important topic? And why is it in context to our food system such an important topic?
So just again, a few numbers. So agriculture, the way we produce our food, is responsible for 70% of the withdrawal of fresh water globally. We mentioned 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it contributes to 80% of our deforestation and forest degradation in the world. So forest degradation and deforestation, of course, also a major contributor to the emission of greenhouse gases. So that's where that intersection is of kind of food, biodiversity, and climate. So that's in terms of the impacts, in terms of the solution and the interdependencies. So if for our long-term viability of our food and agriculture and human society, we are also dependent on those same factors. We need clean water to produce food. We need land. We need healthy, functioning ecosystems to control pests. We've talked about soil health. Healthy soil microbiome is both a long-term carbon sink and a critical component of producing healthy food. So all these things are interrelated, and I think in the end, kind of for me, kind of my plug has been for investors to use those, to look at those and start to build awareness around those systemic interdependencies, because our global economy depends on those same factors as well for a long-term kind of economic viability. So all these things are interrelated. Are kind of generally our tools for evaluating risk don't do a very good job of understanding those interdependencies. But there's now also an emerging, I'd say an emerging kind of sector in finance and business that is using systems approaches to kind of building and evaluating business models as well as financial models. And that's, I think there's a lot of promise there in terms of helping the global financial sector address some of these kind of major global kind of biodiversity, climate, and long-term kind of economic prosperity issues.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect closure on this one, because we always talk about, you know, climate change, energy transition, which is a lot more focused, you know, solely on CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. We always say we should start to talk about, you know, the food transition in at least the same way as we talk about the climate, you know, the energy transition, because the interdependencies, you know, the negative externalities, but also the climate aspects are, you know, enormous on the food system side. So I hope we could give some insights, you know, some interesting anecdotes on this. Rex, I really enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for being here to give us your insights. As I said, I urge everyone to, you know, give a look what you guys do into your work, you know, into the report and research you produce. The true cost accounting, you know, is something that's really needed, and we talked about it. To see something like that on the public market side would be really interesting too. So yeah, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and speak soon.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.